The restaurant was quiet that evening, except for the soft clinking of glasses and low murmurs of diners enjoying their meals. The lights were dim, giving the space a warm golden glow that made every table look important. Every guest seemed significant. Among them was a billionaire who had reserved a corner for his private dinner. He was surrounded by people who laughed at his jokes and hung on his every word. Staff moved quickly around him, anticipating his slightest need. A young waitress moved between tables, carrying plates and refilling glasses. She was careful, polite, and quiet, doing everything she could not to draw attention. Her uniform was simple, neat, and tidy, and her hands moved with practiced ease. She had worked in this restaurant for years, and she knew the routine, the expectations, and the subtle rules of service. Yet that night, a nervous energy seemed to follow her. The billionaire noticed the old piano in the corner of the room. It was a grand instrument, polished and gleaming under the soft lights. He leaned back in his chair, a mischievous smile on his face. "Does anyone here play?" he asked, his voice carrying across the dining area. The question was casual, but there was a tone that dared someone to try. His guests turned their heads, looking for an answer. Amused by the idea of someone stepping forward, the waitress passed near the piano while carrying a tray of desserts. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear of the work, but from a memory she hadn't shared in years. She had learned piano as a child, spent countless hours practicing, and even dreamed of performing on big stages. Life, however, had other plans, and she had given up that dream to take care of her family and survive in a world that demanded practicality over passion. The billionaire noticed her hesitation and smirked. "You there?" he called, pointing a finger. "Can you play?" The room went silent. Guests turned their attention to her. Some whispered, expecting a funny spectacle, a moment that would entertain them. She froze, unsure what to say. Refusing seemed impossible in that space. The pressure was immediate and public. She set the tray down on a nearby table, her heart beating fast. The billionaire leaned forward, his smile sharp, almost cruel. "Don't just stand there. Play something," he said, his tone both commanding and mocking. The guests chuckled softly, some filming on their phones. It was clear to everyone that he expected a failure, a moment of amusement at her expense, her face flushed with embarrassment. She looked at the piano, the smooth keys gleaming like a challenge. Every fiber of her body wanted to run away, but she couldn't. The room felt heavy, the eyes of strangers pressing down, and somewhere deep inside, a stubborn part of her refused to let fear take control. She took a small, shaky breath and approached the instrument, trying to calm the rapid beating of her heart. Each step toward the piano was a test of courage. She remembered the hours she had spent at a different piano years ago, the countless lessons, and the moments of pure joy when music had seemed like a part of her soul. Now, that memory seemed distant but powerful. She placed her hands on the keys, hesitating, unsure if the skill had survived the years of neglect. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Well?" he asked, his eyes sharp, scanning for any sign of hesitation. The guests waited, some smirking, some whispering to each other, certain this would be a short, awkward spectacle. The waitress closed her eyes for a brief moment, centering herself, and opened them again. She could feel the weight of the room, the expectations, the mockery, but also a strange, flickering sense of determination. She could not fail, not because she wanted approval, but because she owed herself this moment, even if it was only a tiny chance. She pressed the first note softly. The sound was clear, sweet, and precise. A few guests raised their eyebrows in surprise, expecting a clumsy mistake, a false note, anything that would confirm their assumptions. But the note rang true, and she pressed another, then another, forming a simple melody. The billionaire's smirk faltered slightly, just enough for her to notice. The room was quiet now, the kind of quiet that makes a person feel exposed and alive at the same time. Her fingers moved carefully at first. Then, with growing confidence, memories of past performances guided her hands, instincts returning as if no time had passed. She was aware of the audience, aware of the laughter that could erupt any second. But she was also aware of the music, and it demanded her full attention. Each note carried emotion, a story she had never told anyone. Now whispered in the silence of the restaurant, The guests began to lean forward, surprised by the talent emerging from someone they had expected to fail. Phones were still raised, but not in mockery. They were recording something remarkable. The billionaire straightened in his chair, his expression shifting from amusement to curiosity and then to a trace of unease. This was not the joke he had anticipated. This was something far more powerful. She played on, her hands gliding over the keys, bringing the piano to life. The melody grew richer, fuller, and more confident with each passing moment. She could see faces in the audience changing. Smirks turned into expressions of awe. Eyes widened in disbelief. The room, once filled with light chatter, now held a reverent silence. She was no longer just a waitress. She was a musician, commanding attention without a word. For a brief moment, she forgot the fear, the embarrassment, the billionaire's mocking tone. There was only the music flowing through her and into the room. Every note told a story of sacrifice, of lost opportunities, of quiet resilience. Every chord she struck seemed to speak to the soul of the audience, reaching them in ways no words could. The piano was no longer a challenge, but a bridge between her world and theirs. The billionaire's guests shifted in their seats, unsure how to respond. Some whispered, some gasped softly, and others simply stared, captivated by what they had not expected. The power of the moment grew, and she felt it. The room had transformed from a place of judgment into a space of shared experience. She was no longer performing for approval or mocking. She was performing because it was her truth, and that truth demanded to be seen and heard. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys, there was a heartbeat of silence. The notes lingered, hanging in the air, refusing to be ignored. Then, slowly, applause began. It was quiet at first, hesitant, then growing steadily until it filled the room. The guests were clapping for something real, something undeniable. The billionaire remained seated, staring, a complex mix of surprise, respect, and a hint of discomfort on his face. The waitress rose from the piano bench, her hands still trembling slightly, but her heart steady with a new strength. She had faced the impossible in front of strangers, had met mockery with courage, and had reclaimed a part of herself that life had tried to bury. The room had witnessed it all, and no one could erase the memory. For the first time in years, she felt seen not for what she served, but for who she was. That night, the simple act of sitting at a piano had changed everything. The wealthy diners left with a story they would not forget. The billionaire had learned a lesson in humility and surprise, and the waitress, quietly returning to her work, carried a new light in her chest. She had been forced into the spotlight, but she had transformed it into a stage of her own making. In that small, golden-lit restaurant, a moment of real human triumph had unfolded. Leaving its mark on everyone who had watched and listened, the applause slowly died down, leaving the room in a quiet that felt different from before. It was no longer just a restaurant. It was a place where something rare had happened. The waitress stepped back from the piano, her hands still warm from the keys, her breath steadying. Her heart raced, but not from fear. It was from the strange mix of pride and disbelief. She could not believe what had just happened. Neither could the people watching. The billionaire, who had moments ago been the center of attention, now looked uncertain. He had expected a moment of laughter, a spectacle at someone else's expense. Instead, he had been shown talent, skill, and something that could not be bought. He leaned back in his chair, studying the waitress with a new intensity, trying to understand how someone so ordinary in appearance could produce something so extraordinary. Guests murmured among themselves, sharing glances, shaking their heads, and whispering words that reflected surprise and admiration. Some had been recording on their phones, initially expecting to capture a joke, but now realizing they had something remarkable. The contrast between expectation and reality created a ripple of disbelief that moved through the room. The waitress returned to her duties quietly, carrying trays, refilling drinks, and offering polite smiles. She moved with the same practiced efficiency as before, but now there was a subtle difference in her posture, a light in her eyes that had not been there before. Some guests noticed, others did not, but the change was undeniable. She had stepped into a moment of vulnerability and emerged with a quiet strength. As she worked, fragments of memory returned. She remembered the first time she had sat at a piano, the feeling of keys beneath her fingers, the joy of creating sound from silence. She remembered long nights of practice, the ache of fingers and the strain of determination. She remembered performances in small halls, where applause had meant everything. And she remembered the choice she had made to leave that world behind, to serve, to survive, and to put her own dreams in hold. The billionaire watched her from a distance, a mixture of curiosity and disbelief on his face. He had faced people who claimed talent, who had exaggerated their abilities, but none had ever surprised him like this. There was a question in his mind, unspoken, about how someone with such hidden skill had ended up waiting tables. It was a puzzle that tugged at his pride and his understanding of the world. He had money, influence, and power. Yet this simple act of talent had disrupted the dynamic he was used to controlling. Some of the guests approached the piano. Hesitant at first, unsure if they should disturb the moment that had just occurred. They wanted to see if the music had truly been skillful, if it had been more than just a lucky few notes. As they examined the instrument, the waitress noticed their curiosity and felt a small surge of confidence. The piano had been an instrument of her past, a reminder of what she had once loved. Now, it had become a bridge between who she was and who she could be again. The room began to return to its normal rhythm, yet the energy had shifted. People talked in low voices, some still amazed by what they had seen. Conversations were laced with admiration, disbelief, and speculation. The billionaire remained in his seat, his demeanor less certain than before, his smile now reserved, thoughtful. He had underestimated the power of hidden talent, and it was a humbling realization. The waitress moved between tables, her mind partially on her work, partially on the ripple she had caused. She thought about the possibilities, the opportunities that might come from this moment, but also about the dangers of attention. She had lived a quiet life, focused on survival and service. She had not sought recognition, and yet recognition had found her in a way she could not ignore. As she cleared a table, a guest leaned forward and spoke softly. They praised her performance, expressing genuine wonder at her skill. They asked how long she had been playing, what inspired her, and if she had ever performed for an audience before. The questions were kind, respectful, and without mockery. For the first time that evening, she felt seen not as a server, but as a person with talent. With a history with depth, the billionaire motioned for her to come closer. She hesitated, unsure of what he wanted, but approached anyway. He asked about her background, the training she had received, and the circumstances that led her to this job. His questions were direct, probing, but not cruel. There was curiosity in his voice, a desire to understand what had led to this unexpected display of skill. She answered carefully, choosing words that were honest but concise. She spoke of her childhood lessons, her dedication to music, and the sacrifices she had made for family and stability. She did not embellish, nor did she apologize for her past choices. She simply told her story as it was, allowing her experiences to speak for themselves. The billionaire listened, nodding, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Guests nearby overheard fragments of the conversation, their interest piqued. Some whispered to each other, noting how unusual it was to witness such talent revealed in an ordinary setting. Others shared smiles of empathy, recognizing the struggles of pursuing passion in a world that often demands practicality over dreams. The atmosphere was changing subtly. From judgment to appreciation, the waitress returned to her tasks, feeling a growing sense of confidence. The music had reminded her of who she was. The reactions of the audience had reminded her that her talent still had value. She realized that her identity was not confined to her job, that her skills and passions were still part of her. Waiting for moments like this to be acknowledged, the room, once intimidating and overwhelming, now felt like a space where she could exist fully. Not just in service to others. As the evening progressed, other servers began to notice the change in her demeanor. She moved with an ease and presence that was new, a quiet authority that commanded respect without a word. Her interactions with guests became more natural, more engaging, and more confident. She smiled genuinely, laughed softly when appropriate, and carried herself with a subtle grace that had been hidden beneath years of routine and caution. The billionaire observed all of this, a complex array of emotions crossing his face. He had entered the restaurant expecting entertainment at someone else's expense. Instead, he had witnessed courage, talent, and authenticity. The experience challenged his assumptions, forcing him to reconsider how he judged others based on appearance and circumstance. The waitress, forced into an impossible situation, had turned it into a moment of revelation both for herself and for those around her. Guests continued to watch, some discreetly, some openly, as the waitress moved through the room. They whispered compliments, asked questions about her training, and expressed admiration for her composure. What had started as a moment of potential humiliation had transformed into an event that inspired and captivated. The contrast between expectation and reality created a tension that lingered in the air, leaving everyone in a state of quiet reflection. Later, as she cleared the final tables and prepared to close the restaurant for the evening, she felt a sense of fulfillment that had little to do with money or praise. The experience had reminded her of her worth, her abilities, and her resilience. She had faced fear, pressure, and public scrutiny, and had emerged not only unscathed, but stronger. The piano had been a mirror, reflecting her true self, and the room had borne witness to her strength. The billionaire approached her once more before leaving. His demeanor was no longer commanding or mocking. Instead, there was a note of respect and curiosity. He asked if she had ever considered performing professionally, if she had thought about sharing her gift with a larger audience. His questions were genuine, without expectation or pressure. And she answered with honesty, expressing both interest and caution. She was aware of opportunities, but also wary of attention and its consequences. As she watched him leave with his entourage, she realized that the evening had changed more than just how others saw her. It had changed how she saw herself. She had reclaimed a part of her life that she thought was lost, reminded herself of her passion, and proven, first to herself and then to others, that her talent could not be hidden forever. The restaurant, once a stage for service and obedience, had become a stage for revelation, courage, human connection. In the quiet moments after the guest had left, she returned to the piano. She touched the keys lightly, feeling the texture beneath her fingers, remembering the joy of creating music. No audience was present, no pressure, just the pure act of playing. And in that moment, she understood that her journey was far from over. She had been forced into the spotlight, yes, but she had discovered something deeper than performance or approval. She had discovered her own voice, her own strength, and her own unbreakable connection to the music she loved. The next evening, the restaurant was quieter than usual. Word had spread among regular guests and staff about the previous night's unexpected performance. People whispered about the waitress who had played the piano with a skill that surprised everyone, including the billionaire. Some were curious, some skeptical, and others simply wanted to witness the person behind the talent. The waitress arrived early, as she always did, moving through the familiar spaces with practiced ease. She wore her uniform, neat and simple, but there was a subtle change in her posture. She walked with quiet confidence, her shoulders held straight, her head slightly lifted. Inside, her thoughts were a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She had performed once under pressure, and while the experience had been powerful, she knew that expectations could weigh heavily. Still, there was a spark she could not ignore, a voice inside her urging her to continue exploring her talent. The piano in the corner waited, polished and ready. She approached it slowly, fingers brushing lightly over the keys, feeling the smooth texture beneath her fingertips. Memories of the previous night flooded back, the shock, the silence, the applause, the way people's expressions had changed. It was a moment that had stayed with her. A moment that had reminded her that her skill mattered, that it could move people, and that it had been dormant for far too long as she sat down. The room filled with a quiet anticipation. Some guests had heard of the performance and had returned, curious to see if it was truly remarkable. Others had arrived unaware, going about their meals until the soft pressure of expectation settled over them. The atmosphere was charged not with tension, but with curiosity. People leaned slightly forward, glasses in hand, waiting. Her fingers hovered over the keys, taking a deep breath. She began with a simple melody, soft and delicate, almost hesitant. The sound was smooth, each note deliberate and controlled. Even in this gentle beginning, there was an undeniable grace, a quiet authority that demanded attention. The audience stopped talking, drawn in by the purity of the music. Slowly, the melody began to grow, evolving into something richer and more complex. She added subtle chords, each one resonating through the room, filling spaces with emotion. Her hands moved with a precision born of years of practice, instincts guiding her through passages that once required intense focus. Now, it flowed naturally, as if the music had always been a part of her. Guests shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, others closing their eyes to absorb the sound fully. Conversations had stopped entirely, even staff paused, carrying trays and glasses with care, unwilling to break the spell. The piano, once a background piece of furniture, had become the center of attention, commanding presence and respect. The billionaire, hid near the corner, observed quietly. His previous smug confidence had vanished, replaced by a mixture of curiosity and surprise. He had underestimated the power of hidden talent. He now watched not as a man expecting entertainment, but as someone trying to comprehend the depth of skill unfolding before him. There was no mockery, no amusement. It was amusement or grudging respect that he could not fully articulate. The music continued to build, moving through passages of emotion and intensity. Some notes carried a light, playful quality, evoking smiles among the listeners. Others were deeper, more somber, stirring feelings that words could not capture. The room responded in subtle ways, a hand over a mouth, a quiet gasp, a slow nod of appreciation. The waitress played not for approval, not for applause, but because the music demanded it, because it had a life of its own. She thought about the journey that had led her here. As a child, she had spent countless hours at the piano, learning, practicing, and dreaming. She remembered the satisfaction of mastering a difficult piece, the thrill of performing for small audiences, the sense of being completely absorbed in something she loved. Life had intervened, responsibilities had taken over, and the piano had become a memory rather than a daily practice. Yet now, all of that training, all of those years of dedication, were flowing back to her in a way she had not expected. The audience was completely captivated. Phones were held up, yes, but now to record beauty, not a joke. Guests whispered among themselves, commenting on the precision, the emotion, and the unexpected depth of the performance. Some were visibly moved, blinking back tears or swaying subtly to the music. The room had transformed from a place of dining into a theater of human emotion. Where sound spoke louder than words, her fingers danced across the keys, now faster, now slower, creating waves of sound that filled every corner of the room. She experimented with dynamics, letting some notes linger and others cascade in rapid succession. The control she had over the instrument was complete, each movement purposeful and expressive. It was clear to anyone listening that this was not a casual skill. This was mastery, born of discipline, passion, love for the art. The billionaire leaned forward, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on the piano. He had seen many performances, met many talented individuals, and spent years in a world of influence where few surprises remained. Yet here was a person, someone he had dismissed as ordinary, who had completely shattered his expectations. He felt a strange mixture of humility and admiration. There was a lesson in what he was witnessing, a reminder that appearances could be deceiving. That talent could hide in the most unlikely places. The waitress felt the room's attention, but it did not frighten her. Instead, it energized her. She could sense the connection between the music and the listeners, the way each chord, each note, resonated with someone in the audience. She was no longer just performing. She was communicating, sharing pieces of her past, her emotions, and her identity through sound. Every phrase she played told a story that words could never fully capture. The audience was spellbound. Conversations had completely ceased. Even the waitstaff, who had grown accustomed to the regular rhythm of the restaurant, paused to watch. The energy in the room was electric but gentle, a collective experience of wonder and admiration. People who had come expecting a casual evening of dining were now witnesses to something extraordinary. The music swelled, building to moments of intensity that drew gasps from the listeners. She allowed herself to be carried by the emotions she had kept inside for so long, the frustration of giving up dreams, the quiet resilience, the joy of rediscovering a part of herself that had been buried. Each note was infused with her lived experience, reflection of her journey and the strength she had cultivated along the way. The final passage approached, delicate and slow, yet full of depth. She let the last notes linger in the air, allowing the resonance to fill the room completely. Then, with a final, gentle touch, she lifted her hands from the keys. Silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of expectation. It was the silence of awe, of people trying to absorb what they had just experienced. Then, slowly, applause began. It started quietly, hesitantly, and then grew steadily, filling the room. The audience rose to their feet, some clapping loudly, some wiping tears, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The power of the performance had moved them beyond judgment or expectation. The room had been transformed by something simple, something human, and yet something extraordinary. The billionaire remained seated, clapping slowly, thoughtfully. He had entered the evening expecting amusement, but he had received something far more valuable, a lesson in humility, a reminder of hidden potential, and the opportunity to witness authentic human talent. The waitress, breathing deeply, stood and acknowledged the room with a modest nod. She had faced pressure, expectations, and doubt, and she had emerged not only unscathed, but triumphant. That night, the piano was no longer just an instrument in the corner. It had become a conduit for human emotion, a testament to perseverance, and a mirror reflecting the depth of the performer's character. The waitress had revealed more than skill. She had revealed strength, courage, and the enduring power of pursuing one's passion. The audience, changed by what they had witnessed, would not forget the sound of her playing or the presence of her spirit. The restaurant felt different that evening, almost charged with an energy that could be felt without words. The guests were more attentive, curious about what might unfold next. Word of the waitress's previous performance had spread, and many had returned to witness it themselves. Others were hearing the story for the first time, intrigued by the notion of someone ordinary revealing extraordinary talent. The atmosphere was quiet, tense with anticipation, yet filled with warmth and wonder. The waitress arrived early, moving through the restaurant with calm confidence. Her uniform was neat, her expression composed, but her heart carried a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She knew the power of the piano and what it could evoke. The memories of past performances and the rush of rediscovery lingered in her mind, creating a balance between restraint and energy. She approached the instrument, fingers brushing lightly across the keys, feeling the familiar smoothness beneath her touch. As she sat down, the room seemed to hold its breath. Conversations faded, glasses clinked less frequently, and eyes turned toward the corner where the piano stood. There was a subtle tension, the kind that comes when people expect something significant to occur. She closed her eyes briefly, centering herself, letting the familiar rhythm of her breath guide her. When she opened them, the room felt both vast and intimate, a space where music could tell a story words never could. Her fingers lifted, hesitating for just a moment before striking the first chord. It was soft, delicate, almost tentative, yet every note resonated clearly. The guests leaned forward instinctively, drawn in by the purity of the sound. Even the staff paused in their movements, noticing that this was not a casual performance, but something deeper, something human and alive. The melody began slowly, building with each measure, careful layering of emotion and expression. As the music unfolded, she allowed herself to move more freely. The notes flowed, carrying fragments of her life, her struggles, her quiet determination, and her rediscovered joy. She played with precision and care, but also with a softness that spoke of vulnerability. The contrast between strength and tenderness created a profound connection with the audience. The room was silent except for the music, and in that silence, every person felt the impact of her performance. The billionaire, seated at a table near the piano, watched intently. He had been present for many performances, had witnessed countless displays of talent, yet nothing compared to this. He had underestimated her, dismissed her as ordinary. And now he was forced to reconsider everything he assumed about appearances and potential. His smirk had disappeared, replaced by curiosity, admiration, and a quiet humility. He realized that wealth and influence could not conjure this kind of authenticity or emotion. The melody shifted, growing more complex. She played with subtle variations, weaving in chords that resonated deeply within the room. Some notes were light and playful, eliciting smiles, while others were deeper, more somber, touching the hearts of the listeners. She allowed the music to carry her forward, following instincts built from years of practice and a lifetime of passion. Each phrase was intentional, yet felt effortless, a reflection of skill and lived experience. Guests responded without words. Some closed their eyes, letting the music fill their senses. Others nodded slowly, expressions of awe and understanding on their faces. There was no laughter, no judgmentally appreciation for the beauty unfolding before them. Phones that had once been raised to capture a spectacle were now simply recording something remarkable, something they might not witness again in their lives. The room seemed to breathe with her music. Even the air felt heavier with emotion, charged with a shared experience. People shifted in their seats, leaning toward one another to exchange whispers of wonder, yet not wanting to break the spell. Every chord carried meaning, telling a story of resilience, sacrifice, and rediscovery. Her fingers moved across the keys with fluidity and purpose, the kind of movement born from years of dedication and the rediscovery of a lost passion. The billionaire watched, unable to look away. He had come expecting amusement, but instead he found himself witnessing mastery and courage. He realized that this moment could not be bought or commanded. It was earned through patience, dedication, and the willingness to embrace vulnerability. There was a lesson here that he could not ignore. True talent is not always visible, and appearances are not always a reflection of capability. The music rose and fell, each section bringing new emotion. Some notes were playful, dancing lightly across the keys. Others were deep and resonant, carrying a weight of experience. The audience felt every nuance, reacting subtly with quiet gasps, soft smiles, and slow, deliberate nods. The waitress played not for applause, but for expression, for the release of the emotions she had held inside for so long. And in that release, the room was transformed as the piece approached its climax. The music became more intense, more intricate. She allowed herself to pour every feeling into her playing: the struggles, doubts, the perseverance, the quiet victories that life had handed her one by one. The audience felt it, connected to it, and in that connection, the room was no longer just a restaurant. It was a space where human emotion could be shared without words, a place where music spoke louder than conversation. The final notes approached, delicate yet powerful. She slowed her pace, letting each chord resonate fully before moving to the next. The sound filled every corner of the room, creating a sense of fullness and completion. Then, with a gentle lift of her hands, the last note faded, leaving a silence that was both heavy and beautiful. It was a silence that invited reflection, allowing the audience to absorb what they had just experienced. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then slowly, applause began. It started quietly, hesitant, almost reverent, and then grew steadily, filling the room with energy and admiration. Some guests stood, clapping and cheering, while others wiped away quiet tears. The waitress rose from the piano bench, bowing her head modestly, her heart racing but steady. She had given everything to the performance. The room had responded with appreciation and awe. The billionaire, standing now, clapped slowly, thoughtfully. He had learned a lesson he would not forget: the power of hidden talent, the importance of humility, and the way a person could rise above expectations when given even a small opportunity. He had been wrong to assume weakness, wrong to mock. And now he saw the truth in the strength, skill, and courage of someone he had dismissed. Guests approached her afterward, offering compliments and words of encouragement. Some asked about her past, her training, and how she had come to master such skill. She answered humbly, sharing bits of her story without exaggeration or seeking attention. Her words were simple, sincere, and human. The applause and praise were gratifying. But what mattered most was the recognition of her talent, her dedication, and the courage she had shown as the evening ended and the guests departed. The room felt lighter, warmer, and full of an energy that lingered long after the music had stopped. The waitress cleaned up quietly, moving with her usual grace, but carrying a new sense of confidence. She had faced judgment, expectation, and pressure, and had turned it into a moment of revelation, not just for herself, but for everyone who had witnessed it. That night, the piano was more than an instrument. It had become a conduit for emotion, a mirror reflecting courage and resilience. The audience had been transformed, not just by skill, but by authenticity, passion, and the undeniable human spirit. The waitress had reclaimed a part of herself she had thought lost, proving that true talent cannot be hidden forever, and that moments of human connection can arise in the most unexpected places. The evening after her stunning performance, the restaurant was unusually quiet. The regular hum of diners was replaced by a thoughtful, expectant silence. The previous night had left a mark on everyone who had witnessed it. Word had spread through social media, conversations, and the staff's stories about the waitress who had transformed a simple piano into a vessel of emotion and skill. People came not just to eat, but to see if the story was true, to feel the presence of someone who had captivated a room with nothing but music. The waitress arrived early, preparing the restaurant with the calm precision she had cultivated over years of work. Yet beneath her composed exterior, her mind was alive with reflection. The experience of performing the previous nights had been overwhelming and illuminating. She had rediscovered a part of herself she thought had been buried beneath the responsibilities and demands of everyday life. The music had reminded her that her talent was still alive, that her voice mattered, and that she could inspire and move others in ways words could not. Guests began to arrive, some familiar from the nights before, others drawn in by curiosity. There was an energy in the room, a quiet excitement mingled with reverence. The staff moved about efficiently, yet even they were aware that something extraordinary had occurred within these walls. People glanced toward the corner where the piano sat, anticipation clear in their eyes. The restaurant had become more than a place to dine. It was a stage, a space of transformation, and everyone present was part of the story. The waitress moved toward the piano once again, her fingers brushing the keys lightly, remembering the sounds that had filled the room, the reactions of the guests, and the feeling of being seen not for what she served, but for who she was. She had been forced into the spotlight, but she had turned it into a moment of triumph. Her heart swelled with a mixture of pride and humility. She knew that this was not just about her talent, but about courage, resilience, and the ability to rise to unexpected challenges. The billionaire appeared shortly after, entering with his entourage, but there was a noticeable change in his demeanor. The smug confidence that had characterized his presence before was gone, replaced by a quiet curiosity and respect. He had underestimated the power of hidden talent, and the realization weighed on him. As he approached the waitress, he spoke with a tone that was measured and genuine. He asked her about her past, her training, and the experiences that had shaped her. She answered honestly, her words simple yet resonant, sharing a history of dedication, sacrifice, and unwavering passion. Guests listened, drawn into the narrative, appreciating the layers of humanity that had brought the waitress to this point. Some whispered amongst themselves, reflecting on the contrast between expectation and reality, between appearance and true capability. Others were silent, fully absorbed in the unfolding story. The room was alive with connection, not of gossip or spectacle, but of genuine human admiration and understanding. As the evening progressed, the waitress found herself moving effortlessly between her duties and the piano. When she played, the music was richer than ever. It was informed by reflection, by experience, and by the knowledge that her talent had touched lives. Each chord, each note was deliberate and expressive, conveying more than technical skill. It conveyed emotion, history, and authenticity. The audience was mesmerized. Conversations ceased, and the focus shifted entirely to the music and the presence of someone who had refused to be defined by circumstance. The billionaire observed quietly, occasionally nodding, clearly moved by the depth of what he witnessed. He had come expecting amusement, yet he found himself confronted by something far more profound. It was a humbling experience, reminding him that influence and wealth could not replace authenticity, courage, or human skill. He realized that true talent often lies hidden, waiting for a moment when it can emerge with power and clarity. As the night wore on, guests approached the waitress with words of admiration. Some offered opportunities, invitations to perform in private gatherings or events. Others simply expressed gratitude for the beauty and emotion she had shared. She accepted these gestures with humility, aware that her journey was personal, yet recognizing that her talent could now reach beyond the walls of the restaurant. She had been given a stage, and she had used it to reclaim a part of herself. Later, as the restaurant quieted for the night, she returned to the piano one last time. The room was empty, save for the soft glow of lights and the lingering warmth of those who had been present earlier. She touched the keys gently, feeling the familiar texture and resonance. Music flowed freely, no longer pressured by expectation, no longer performing for validation. It was an intimate conversation between herself and the piano, a reaffirmation of her skill, her passion, and her identity in that quiet, reflective moment. She understood the power of her own courage. Being forced into the spotlight had been daunting, yet it had revealed the strength and depth she possessed. The music had allowed her to express what she had long kept inside, to share a story without words, and to connect deeply with others. She felt a sense of liberation, an acknowledgement that her talent was not just skillful fingers on keys, but a part of her spirit that could not be silenced. The billionaire approached once more, this time with a demeanor